Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. I'm just going to kick off with some housekeeping things. My name is James Hadley, and I come from the Trinity Centre for Literary and Cultural Translation, which is hosting this event today. And so I'm very pleased to welcome you and to give these preliminary remarks before I hand over to our hosts. So, as you know, you're joining us today for the Out of Bounds conference. And so as far as housekeeping goes, please stay mute throughout, but you may turn on your cameras if you're so inclined. We do find that it's nice if we can see who we're talking to. So please do feel free to leave your cameras on. If you want to ask questions or make comments, that's very much welcomed. And please do that in the chat box. So throughout the event, we'll have a running chat. And at the end of each panel, we'll have a question and answer session where the chair of each panel will take the questions, or as many of the questions as they can get through, and address them to the various speakers. So we'll be having 3 talks in each panel, and then the question and answer session for all 3 at the end of each panel. If you're posing a question inside the chat box, it's very helpful if you could start off the question with a question mark so that we can easily tell the difference between questions and comments. Apart from that, I'll talk a little bit about the Trinity Centre for Literary and Cultural Translation, which is an organisation inside Trinity College Dublin, which devotes itself to the research and teaching of translation in, of course, cultural and literary terms. So by literary, we mean anything that involves human creativity, and by cultural, we mean anything that involves human interaction. So this conference fits very, very cleanly inside of our research interests. And I'm so pleased to see so many of you and the wide range of different talks that we're going to listen to today on topics from identity and psychology to ecology and creativity. It's fantastic. And as you know, we're talking today about boundaries, and those boundaries can be physical, temporal, theoretical, and logistical, to name just a few. So I'm going to hand over to our hosts today. So it's Tom and Alicia, and they're going to kick us off. So thank you very much.
Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Out of Bounds conference at the Trinity Centre for Literary and Cultural Translation. My name's Tom, as you can see, and it's really such a pleasure to open an event that will realise all of these ideas you sent into us in your submissions. So there might be some construction noise happening outside here. I hope that's not coming through too loudly. And also just to welcome you here, even if it's virtually, and to see all the people we've been communicating with for the past while. Thank you, James, for that for the formal opening of the conference. And now just myself and Alicia would like to kind of welcome you as the organisers by dwelling for a moment on kind of the theme of this whole conference and how it came about. So the idea for focusing on boundaries in all shapes and sizes, particularly those of crisis, it's an attempt not only to kind of address the sort of current moment that we find ourselves in, but also to identify a way into kind of talking across all of the academic and even non-academic disciplines that are represented here today. And it seems to us, I think, that we can never really get away from the sticky notion and tricky notion of a boundary, a limit, or a threshold. And while it may seem self-evident to claim that boundaries really are everywhere, I think they are. We need only to look at the array of disciplines represented here to see that. I think for the field of, the field that my research converges on, which is modern mathematics, holding my hands up, boundaries aren't only important, but they are actually the basis on which new knowledge is built. So I want to share my screen and a little problem for just a minute or two. Is that coming up for everybody okay? Brilliant. So if you'll permit me to descend into that subject that you either loved or loathed at school for just a few minutes, I'd like to illustrate this by sharing a little conundrum that sparked a whole new line of thinking about boundaries and about spaces in mathematics, but also left a lasting impact not only on the field itself, but in all other fields that rely on any understanding of networks, structures, and connections. So let's travel in time and space to the city of Königsberg in the Kingdom of Prussia in the early 18th century. The home of the prolific German philosopher Immanuel Kant, the city has, of course, witnessed the shifting of its own geographical boundaries that surround it, for it's now known as the city of Kaliningrad in contemporary Russia. In 1736, the Swiss mathematician Leonhard Euler took on what seems to be a relatively simple geographical puzzle. In the city was constructed around both sides of perhaps the most familiar type of geographical boundary that we know, a river, namely the River Pregel that you can see running on the map here. Sorry, making sure the slides can move okay. And yes, it was often asked if one could plan a route that traverses all 7 bridges that connect the 2 sides of the river and also these 2 large islands that sit in the middle. So connect them to both sides of the river and the islands themselves by crossing the 7 bridges once, but only once. And many indeed tried, and we could of course zoom in on the scene here, the network of the 7 bridges, and maybe start tracing out the bridges with our pencils to try and chart out a pathway here. You might even be doing it mentally as I'm talking. We could even abstract this a little more for clarity, end up with something like this, labeling each of the sections and creating a passable representation of that original territory. Each time you trace a path, however, you might already be noticing that you always leave at least one bridge inaccessible because you've crossed all of the other ones. It took Euler, however, to prove that the puzzle is indeed unsolvable. There is no possible route that traverses all 7 bridges once and only once. But it's not the insolvability of this problem, the Königsberg problem, that really stuck with mathematicians. Rather, it's the way of thinking that Euler introduced. He realized it's utterly irrelevant how long the bridges are, how large the land masses are, and even where you begin on the map, we could start at any point, we'll still encounter the same problem. All that matters is that there is a network of crossings. When we strip away all the features of a reliable map, we are left with points representing our islands, and in mathematics, what we call edges, the lines that connect them, representing in this case the 7 bridges that cross a boundary. A topographical problem has become a topological one. We've dispensed with all concern for sizes and shapes, and we could stretch and distort any of these lines here, bending them in any arbitrary way, but we would still have the same problem, the same conundrum. Just under 200 years later, in the early 20th century, Euler's ideas were turned into a new field in mathematics, namely topology, by a German mathematician, Felix Hausdorff. Without going into it in too much detail, it's essentially the study of space in mathematics. Topology asks what's left when we allow all of our familiar notions of shape and size and scale and perspective to fall away. It turns out that we are left with only the concept of inside versus outside. Something is either inside a space or it is outside of a space, which is to say we are left with the awareness of a boundary. Topology, which serves as the backbone for all of modern mathematics, has crept into other fields despite its highly intangible nature. It describes the shape of the cosmos, providing a language for Einstein's theories of relativity. It articulates the nanostructure of molecules in biology and forms the basis of much of computational science and robotics. In mathematics, it is the most abstract way of understanding spaces that our fallible brains can allow for. There is no more abstract structure. Yet the notion of a boundary endures. That's the only thing that endures. So from a mathematical point of view, it's thoroughly unsurprising to me that across all of the fields represented at the conference today, that boundaries really do abound. And with that, welcome to Out of Bounds, and I'd like to hand over to Alicia.
So hello and welcome, as Tom said, and thanks so much again just to our contributors for their really fascinating and relevant abstracts, and I just really can't wait to see people's talks. And thanks to everyone attending for being here today. You've all made organising this conference just like a really nice experience for us. I'm also going to give like something in the way of a small kind of arts introduction to just this idea of boundaries that we've been talking about. And I am also going to briefly share my screen. So can you all see that okay? So shown virtually last January by the Douglas Hyde Gallery. I'm just going to check everybody can hear me, yes. Shown virtually last January by the Douglas Hyde Gallery, Sasha Litvintsev's short film Every Rupture depicts 3 situations marked by boundaries and crisis. The films have all been made before the pandemic, but they are narrated retrospectively with new knowledge of how COVID-19 has changed the way we relate to the world. The first film shows scenes aboard a cruise ship during the Brexit referendum. It then shows a forest in Lithuania suffering what the speaker calls decay in concentric circles. And finally, the film depicts tourists near some Roman columns, a scene from a time when, as the narrative notes, we touch things without fear. The speaker summarizes the effect of these images, saying how they do not describe what is happening now, but it's only now that I understand how they all fit together. Time seems split and understanding strangely deferred. Something has happened to how we consume media during the pandemic, and perhaps we see art differently now. References have acquired an uncanny coincidental significance. The phrases quarantine and lockdown in sci-fi films now seem prophetic. Litvintseva's film features kaleidoscopic doubled scenes like the one here, and motifs of mirroring, such as trees reflected in water. The boundaries in these scenes seem somehow both porous and sharp. The images seem to evoke a hall of mirrors endlessness at the same time as they demarcate the world into befores and afters. In the pandemic, we consume virtual art in a way that's perhaps like both contained and dispersed. And maybe we're more conscious than ever of art as witnessing and documentation. This also seems a testament to artistic media's ability to make us feel less alone, even if this collectivity can be uncomfortable where the pandemic is concerned. So we invite you to join us for this conference in what itself seems a virtual area traversing physical borders. Welcome to Out of Bounds 2021.